In November of 1992, heavy equipment operators clearing ground for a new section of California State Route 54 near San Diego cut into something none of them had a name for. A dense cluster of enormous fossilized bones sitting in the freeway right of way. Construction stopped. A team from the San Diego Natural History Museum was called in, led onto the site by museum paleontologist Richard Cerutti, and for the next 5 months they carefully excavated what turned out to be the remains of a single mastodon, along with something stranger lying right beside it, 5 large stones that did not belong in that layer of earth naturally, positioned close enough to the shattered bones to raise an immediate, uncomfortable question. Had something or someone broken these bones on purpose? The team recorded everything, packed the bones and stones away, and then did something almost nobody expected. They waited. For 25 years, this site sat quietly in storage while the technology needed to answer that question caught up to the evidence itself. When the answer finally came, in a paper published in the journal Nature in 2017, it did not just surprise the archaeological world, it split it in half, because the date attached to those broken bones was not 15,000 years or 20,000 years. It was roughly 130,000 years, a number so far outside every accepted timeline for humans in the Americas that many scientists' first reaction was simply to say it could not be true. Subscribe to the Historia Archive and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This channel goes looking for exactly the kind of evidence that forces real scientists to argue in public. And there is another investigation like this one waiting for you right after this. 5 months in the freeway dirt, the site that would eventually become known as the Cerutti Mastodon site began, like a great deal of American archaeology, as an accident of infrastructure. California's State Route 54 needed to expand, and as construction crews graded the corridor near San Diego in the fall of 1992, their equipment exposed a dense concentration of large fossil bone. Richard Cerutti, a paleontologist with the San Diego Natural History Museum, experienced in salvage excavations tied to construction projects across the region, was brought in to assess the find and quickly recognized it as significant enough to warrant a full, careful excavation rather than a quick removal. Over the following 5 months, museum paleontologists methodically uncovered the remains of a single mastodon, a large, now extinct relative of modern elephants that once ranged across much of North America. What made the site unusual was not the mastodon itself. Mastodon remains, while always scientifically valuable, are not especially rare in California's fossil record. What made this particular excavation strange was the condition of the bones and what was found lying next to them. Several of the mastodon's large limb bones were broken in a pattern that immediately caught the excavation team's attention, sharp, spiral-shaped fractures, rather than the kind of splintering or crumbling you typically see in bone that has simply weathered and decayed over a long period buried in the ground. Alongside the broken bones, the team recovered 5 large stones, cobbles that showed wear patterns consistent with having been used as hammers and anvils, tools capable of delivering the kind of forceful, controlled blow needed to produce exactly this type of spiral fracture in fresh, still slightly flexible bone. Bone that has been dead and buried for a very long time tends to be dry and mineralized, and it breaks differently, more like stone than like a green branch. Spiral fractures like the ones found on this mastodon typically require bone that still retains some of its natural moisture and structural flexibility, meaning whatever broke these particular bones most likely did so relatively soon after the animal died, not centuries or millennia later through ordinary geological weathering. The excavation team documented all of it meticulously, catalogued the bones and stones, and then, rather than rushing to a dramatic conclusion, the site went quiet. 25 years of silence gapped between excavation in 1992 and publication in 2017 is one of the most unusual aspects of this entire story, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets because it directly undercuts the idea that anyone was trying to suppress this discovery. A site that someone wanted buried, in the sense of hidden rather than simply stored, does not typically get formally excavated by a public museum, catalogued, preserved, and eventually subjected to the most rigorous available dating technology and published in one of the most prestigious and widely read scientific journals in the world. What actually happened during those 25 years was slower and less dramatic than a cover-up. The spiral fractures and the associated stones were suggestive, but suggestive is not the same as proven, and the museum team understood that a claim this extraordinary, one that would potentially rewrite the entire accepted timeline of human presence in the Americas, needed a level of dating precision that simply was not available or was not yet fully trusted. In the early 1990s, the breakthrough came through a technique called uranium series dating, a method that measures the radioactive decay of uranium isotopes trapped inside bone material as it slowly converts into other elements over enormous spans of time. Unlike radiocarbon dating, which becomes unreliable for material much older than about 50,000 years, because the relevant carbon isotope decays too completely to measure accurately, uranium series dating can, under the right conditions, reach much further back into the hundreds of thousands of years. Applying this method to bone recovered from the Cerutti site required both the refinement of the dating technique itself and researchers willing to test material this old and this consequential. And it was not until Stephen Holen, a specialist in early human bone modification, working alongside Richard Cerutti, Thomas Desmarais of the San Diego Natural History Museum, and a broader team of collaborators brought uranium series analysis to the project that a hard number finally emerged. When the results came back, they placed the Mastodon bones at approximately 130,700 years old, with a margin of error the team described as remarkably tight for material of this age. If a discovery that sat quietly in storage for 25 years before anyone dared publish it is the kind of patient, careful science you want more of, take a second and subscribe now, because that patience is exactly what this channel tries to honor. What broke these bones? The core argument published in the 2017 Nature paper rests on a comparison researchers have used for decades to identify deliberate bone processing at ancient sites around the world. When large, still relatively fresh bones are struck with a hard hammerstone against a solid anvil stone, in an effort to break them open and access the nutrient-rich marrow inside, the resulting fractures follow a distinctive spiral pattern, different from the fractures produced by natural causes like trampling, sediment compaction, or ordinary decay over time. The team behind the Cerutti findings argued that several of the mastodon's bones displayed exactly this signature: spiral fractures consistent with percussion breakage, while the bone still retained organic flexibility, alongside cone-shaped impact marks and flake scars on the associated stones consistent with their use as hammers and anvils. Taken together, the team concluded, The most reasonable explanation was that some hominin species deliberately and skillfully broke these bones open for their marrow using tools, at a location and a moment in time that placed hominins in North America more than 100,000 years earlier than any previously accepted evidence allowed. It is worth being clear about what species of hominin that hominin might have been, because the paper itself was notably cautious on this point. Anatomically modern Homo sapiens are not confirmed to have existed in the Americas anywhere close to 130,000 years ago under any widely accepted model, which means the researchers were implicitly raising the possibility of some other earlier hominin species reaching North America by a route and a method nobody has otherwise documented. That is an enormous claim sitting quietly underneath an already enormous claim, and it is part of why the paper generated the kind of immediate, intense scrutiny that most archaeological publications never see. What the Mastodon was doing. There it helps to picture the landscape this animal actually died in, because the site was never an isolated curiosity sitting in empty desert. During the period the Cerutti team proposes for this mastodon's death, the San Diego region looked dramatically different from the dense urban corridor that surrounds the site today, a mix of grassland, woodland, and seasonal wetlands supporting a range of large Pleistocene mammals across Southern California, mastodons among them, grazing and browsing across a landscape shaped by a climate far wetter and cooler than the modern regions. The specific mastodon recovered at the site was based on skeletal analysis, a large adult male, and the excavation recovered a substantial portion of its skeleton, including major limb bones, tusks, and molars, giving researchers a reasonably complete picture of the individual animal even before any argument about how it died and how its bones were later broken. This was not a scattered handful of fragments pulled from a disturbed context. It was a coherent, well-preserved skeleton embedded in a sedimentary layer that geologists were able to date independently of the bone material itself, using the surrounding sediment's own depositional history to help confirm that the bones had not been washed in from somewhere else or mixed together from different time periods. That geological context matters because one of the standard ways skeptics challenge a controversial dated find is by questioning whether the material is really as old as the surrounding sediment suggests, or whether it has been disturbed and redeposited. The Cerutti team's answer rested on showing that the bone bed sat within an intact, undisturbed layer, consistent, both stratigraphically and through direct uranium series dating of the bone itself, which is part of why the original excavation team felt confident enough to eventually publish, even knowing exactly how much scrutiny a number like 130,000 years would invite. The number that changed everything to understand exactly how disruptive 130,000 years is as a claim. It helps to place it beside the other major milestones in the ongoing scientific debate over when humans first reached the Americas. For most of the 20th century, the accepted timeline centered on the Clovis culture dated to roughly 13,000 years ago. Over the past few decades, a growing body of credible pre-Clovis evidence has pushed that timeline back further. Sites like Monte Verde in Chile, suggesting human presence around 14,500 years ago, and the White Sands footprints in New Mexico, confirmed through multiple independent dating methods, establishing a confirmed human presence in North America between 21 and 23,000 years ago. Even the most aggressive Well-supported pre-Clovis claims in circulation today top out somewhere in that range, tens of thousands of years, not hundreds of thousands. The Cerutti Mastodon claim does not simply extend that established range. It obliterates it, proposing a date roughly 6 times older than the White Sands footprints and nearly 10 times older than Clovis. A claim of this magnitude does not just add a chapter to the existing story of how the Americas were peopled. It would require rewriting the story almost entirely, raising immediate follow-up questions that the Cerutti site itself has no way to answer. If hominins were present in North America 130,000 years ago, who were they? How did they get there at a time predating every proposed migration route by an enormous margin? And why, in more than 3 decades since the original excavation, has no other site anywhere in the Americas produced comparable evidence at anything close to this age? Extraordinary claims of this scale typically require an extraordinary weight of corroborating evidence before the broader scientific community accepts them. And it is precisely that weight of corroboration that the Cerutti site, standing alone, has so far been unable to supply. The scientists, Wushio said, know the response from the broader archaeological community was immediate, detailed, and in many cases sharply critical, and it came from named, credentialed researchers publishing their objections openly rather than working to suppress the original claim. Archaeologist Donald Grayson told reporters he was, in his words, astonished, not because the paper's argument was compelling, but because he found it so weak. David Meltzer, a leading authority on the peopling of the Americas, stated flatly that he was not buying what was being sold. Archaeologist Gary Haynes proposed an alternative explanation entirely, suggesting that the heavy construction equipment already active at the site in 1992, the very machinery that led to the discovery in the first place, could plausibly have caused the bone fractures and shifted the stones into their apparent association, well after the mastodon's collagen and other organic material had already broken down, undermining the age-based argument for deliberate ancient breakage. The most comprehensive rebuttal arrived as a formal academic paper, a joint critique authored by a substantial group of established archaeologists, including Todd Brage, Tom Dilhay, John Erlandson, Scott Fitzpatrick, Donald Grayson, Vance Holliday, Robert Kelly, Richard Klein, David Meltzer, and Torben Rick, arguing collectively that the site's features were better explained by ordinary geological and mechanical processes than by deliberate hominin activity. Their objection centered on several specific gaps in the original claim. No stone tool debris, no flakes, no discarded cores. The kind of manufacturing waste that almost always accumulates wherever ancient people worked stone was found anywhere at the site, an absence that struck many archaeologists as difficult to reconcile with a location where stone tools were supposedly being actively used. No cut marks, the kind of fine linear scoring typically left on bone when it is butchered with a sharp stone edge to remove meat, were identified either, leaving the case resting entirely on the fracture patterns and the stone's proximity, rather than on multiple independent categories of supporting evidence. And perhaps most significantly, the Cerutti site remains more than 3 decades later essentially alone. No comparable site anywhere in North or South America has produced similar evidence at anything close to this age. And in a field where major claims are normally corroborated by a pattern of related discoveries, a single, isolated site carrying this much interpretive weight makes many researchers deeply uneasy. If watching 2 teams of legitimate, Credentialed scientists argue this fiercely in public, using named evidence you can go check yourself. Is the kind of real science you want more of? Subscribe now, because that is exactly what this channel keeps digging into. The Smithsonian scientist, Wushu said maybe here, is where the popular version of this story usually gets something important backward. The framing that a single powerful institution moved to suppress or bury this discovery does not hold up against what actually happened in the scientific literature, and one detail in particular makes that clear. Brianna Pobina, a paleoanthropologist with the Smithsonian Institution's Human Origins Program, was among the researchers who engaged publicly with the Cerutti claim, and her response was notably more open than many of the harshest outside critics. She described the combined weight of the evidence as, in her assessment, on its way toward being convincing, and noted that ruling out natural bone breakage entirely is genuinely difficult to do with complete certainty in any fossil assemblage this old. That is not the position of an institution working to bury an inconvenient discovery. It is the position of a working scientist engaging carefully and publicly with evidence she found intriguing, but not yet fully settled exactly the kind of measured, provisional response good science is supposed to produce when the evidence is genuinely ambiguous. The sharpest, most dismissive rejections of the Cerutti claim did not come from the Smithsonian at all. They came from a broader coalition of specialists in the peopling of the Americas, working at universities and research institutions across the country, publishing their skepticism openly, under their own names, in peer-reviewed journals anyone can read today. If there was ever a unified institutional effort to bury this discovery, the public record simply does not show one. What the record shows instead is a contested, unresolved, occasionally heated scientific debate, playing out exactly where scientific debates are supposed to play out, in published papers, formal rebuttals, and on-the-record interviews, with credentialed experts landing in different places along a spectrum from open curiosity to firm rejection. Why White Sands, one and Cerutti. Didn't is worth asking directly why one extraordinarily old claim about humans in the Americas, the White Sands footprints, moved from controversial to broadly accepted within a couple of years, while another extraordinarily old claim, the Cerutti Mastodon site, remains stuck in dispute more than 7 years after publication, because the comparison reveals exactly what separates a claim that survives scrutiny from one that does not. White Sands offered direct evidence. An actual footprint is unambiguous physical proof that a human foot touched that exact spot on that day, requiring no chain of interpretation about fracture mechanics or stoneware patterns. Cerutti offers only indirect evidence, a pattern of bone breakage and stoneware that has to be interpreted, and every interpretation carries the possibility of an alternative, non-human explanation sitting right alongside it. White Sands was confirmed using multiple independent dating methods, radiocarbon on seeds, radiocarbon on pollen, and optically stimulated luminescence on quartz grains, 3 different techniques converging on the same number. Cerutti rests on a single dating method applied to a single site. White Sands sits within a broader, growing pattern of increasingly old, but methodologically solid pre-Clovis sites across the Americas, each one making the next slightly easier to accept. Cerutti stands alone, more than 100,000 years outside that pattern, with nothing else anywhere on either continent to corroborate it. None of that proves the Cerutti team is wrong. Good scientists on both sides of this debate have been careful to say exactly that. That unresolved is not the same as disproven, and that a claim this disruptive deserves continued investigation rather than a permanent verdict either way. What the comparison does show is that when the evidence is direct, repeatable, and independently corroborated, as it was at White Sands, the scientific community moves toward consensus relatively quickly, even when the conclusion overturns decades of prior thinking. When the evidence is indirect, singular, and dependent on interpretation, as it is at Cerutti, that same community rightly moves much more slowly, and slow, contested, occasionally uncomfortable disagreement is not evidence of a cover-up. It is evidence that the process is working exactly as it should. What happens next to this site is in some ways out of anyone's hands. Uranium series dating cannot be repeated on a second, independent sample of the exact same bones without risking damage to material that can never be replaced. And no comparable second site has emerged anywhere in the Americas in the years since publication to either strengthen or weaken the original claim through corroboration. That leaves the Cerutti Mastodon sitting in an unusually static kind of limbo, a single, carefully excavated, professionally published claim that the field has spent years arguing about, without anyone producing the kind of decisive second piece of evidence that normally settles disputes like this one. Some researchers continue actively searching for exactly that second site, aware that if hominins really were active in North America 130,000 years ago, this bone bed in a San Diego freeway corridor is very unlikely to be the only trace they ever left behind. Thank you for watching. The Cerutti Mastodon site has not been proven, and it has not been disproven either. It remains one of the most genuinely open questions in American archaeology today. Where do you think the actual truth is sitting, in the bones, in the stones, or in the machinery that dug them both up? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next documentary.